Okay, so exegetical sign acts in the book of Jeremiah. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, prophets are depicted as mediating divine knowledge, not only through the verbal utterance or the written word, but also by means of dramatic non-verbal performances, or so-called sign acts, also known as symbolic actions. Now, in the judgment of older scholarship, sign acts brokered a degree of historical recollection as the layers of reduction peeled away to reveal preserved residue of the deeds and words of a historical prophet. Prevailing in more recent scholarly discussion is an increased appreciation for sign acts as, first and foremost, complex literary artifacts. So the growing modern consensus is that whether or not sign acts can be taken as remnants of historical prophetic performances, and the extent to which this is the case may ultimately be irrecoverable to us, their meaning and function can now be rightly understood only with a proper sensitivity to their literary texture. Now, I think here of Andrea Byers' recent monograph, Tutton Texton, or the edited volume on Ezekiel's sign acts by Tyler Mayfield and Penelope Barter, both published in the previous 2 years. Now, this paper builds on this literary turn, but sets off in a slightly different direction. My contention is that a vital but often overlooked factor for understanding the composition, function, and significance of Jeremiah's sign acts is their deeply exegetical nature. The central imagery of the sign acts, such as Jeremiah's wearing of the yoke or his ruined loincloth, displays verbal and topical affinities with a web of other Jeremianic texts. And in my judgment, a compelling case can be made that these inner-biblical links are no mere welter of coincidence, but the result of deliberate and studied literary borrowing by the sign acts. The Jeremianic sign acts, in other words, emerge as exegetical creation. We might therefore describe them as exegetical sign acts. They're constructed from textual materials. What is more, driving their composition is a discernible exegetical logic. By attending to the creative exegetical transformations the sign acts effect vis-a-vis their literary sources, it is possible to detect an effort to disclose, explicate, adjust, and amplify the representation of divine action found in the earlier Jeremianic traditions. So the exegetical efforts can dance around the deeds ascribed to Yahweh. Thus, the sign acts embody, in the form of imagined prophetic performance, a sophisticated exegetical discourse about the role of the divine in Israel's history as depicted within the book of Jeremiah. Now, for reasons of time, I can only look at a couple of examples, but the full version of the study that explores the sign acts in Jeremiah more fully is shortly coming out in the Journal of Biblical Literature. And I detect a similar literary phenomenon in other sign acts. And after the case studies, I will briefly zoom out for some larger questions about prophetic biography, performance, and the idea that Jeremiah in these sign acts is imagined as performing texts. Now, I want to start with the sign acts in Jeremiah 25. It yields the image of the cup of wine. The prophet is commanded to take the cup from the divine hand and make the nations, the objects of Yahweh's wrath, drink from it. Take from my hand this cup of wine, of the wine of wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. Drink, stagger, be crazed, because of the word that I'm sending among them. Drink, be drunk, you must drink. So the cup of wine. Now, it is a visionary sign act, and of course, this raises wider questions about what counts as a sign act in the first place. Now, form critically, it fits the category, but for some scholars, actions performed in visions do not qualify as sign acts because, by their definition, a sign act is a historical performance. But there is, of course, a certain circularity in the creation of such a category, a kind of putting the cart before the horse. Be that as it may, this sign act, I would suggest, appears uniquely closely related to an oracle in Jeremiah 51:7. Babylon was a golden cup in Yahweh's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine, and so the nations went mad. Now, taken as a group, the verbal correspondences are too many and too densely clustered to be coincidental with the exact combination of the elements unique to these two passages. To be sure, some lexical connections by themselves may seem not too uncommon since they reflect the shared topic of drinking wine. And the cup of divine wrath is an image with deep roots in biblical iconography. But clinching the identification of an allusion are the much rarer and more distinctive elements in the mix, such as to be mad or nations. As regards the directionality, the most persuasive line of evidence, in my view, is that the sign act emerges as more expansive and elaborate in comparison with its oracular counterpart. Jeremiah 51:7 furnishes the core thematic content and lexical stock, and the sign act enriches this basic scaffolding with extra details to craft a detailed scene. Now, the sign act also introduces a crucial change as compared to its textual precursor. It concerns the representation of the deity. In Jeremiah 51:7, the explanation for the unfolding of events makes sparse reference to divine causality. Instead, the focus is resolutely on Babylon. Thus, Jeremiah 51:7 clothes Babylon with gold, a reference to her great and intoxicating wealth. It was that wealth that seduced the nations to their own destruction. Now, given that the description of Babylon as a cup in Yahweh's hand is widely regarded as a later gloss, it is instructive that the oracle possibly omits mention of Yahweh altogether. Now, this is not to argue that the events in Jeremiah 51:7 cannot be implicitly divinely guided, nor should human instrumentality be, in any case, pitted against divine initiative in Jeremiah. But even with this expression, Yahweh's hand in place, the accent in the verse falls on Babylon's role, as evident, for instance, from the use of the word drunken, a participle in the D stem with Babylon as the subject. So in this oracle, the cup of gold is imbued with the corrupt glitter of a grasping human empire. I would argue then that it is this opaque nature of the divine role that may have stimulated the intervention of the sign act. In the sign act, the geopolitical situation gains a subtle reinterpretation. It reveals Yahweh's hand in the nation's entanglement with the cup and its wine. Yahweh causes the nations to drink the cup. The verb to drink is now in the H stem and commands them to be drunk. Here we find an imperative. Now, the sign act, in other words, establishes the protagonistic role of the deity, which is somewhat obscure in the original oracle. The sign act makes a special point to divulge that the cup is lodged in Yahweh's hand. Yahweh sends Jeremiah to administer the drink to the nation. A new literary element enters the scene, the sword, yet another lethal agent sent by Yahweh that operates alongside the wine. In fact, Babylon fades into the background. It is through the It is through Yahweh's agency that these events transpire, while Babylon, a power only in a derivative rather than ultimate sense, will be forced, in due course, to drink the wine like the other nations. So such exegetical transformations have the cumulative effect of accentuating the divine role and attenuating that of Babylon as against the original oracle in Jeremiah 51:7. In short, the exegetical agenda of the Synact is to lift the veil on the role of divine providence and historical causality. It enforces a more explicitly theocentric perspective with an overriding emphasis on divine action. Note also that the Synact, within the architecture of the book of Jeremiah, occupies a decidedly strategic place. In the MT and Septuagint alike, the pericope is lodged as a climactic and summative statement of judgment, concluding the first half of the book. It also creates a strategic link to the so-called oracles against the nations and eventual judgment against Babylon. So this is the Synact of the cup of wine. Now, another illustration of this literary phenomenon comes from the sign of the yoke in Jeremiah 27. Now, this episode revolves around the yoke as a symbol of divinely decreed subjugation to the imperial Babylonian overlord. Through this foreign yoke, paradoxically, lies a salvific path to survival. Thus the Lord said to me, make yourself straps and yoke bars and put them on your neck. Any nation that will bring its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, I will leave on its land. Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and leave. Now, the prophetic performance here bears strong resemblance to a Jeremianic oracle that forecasts the inauguration of a rather different salvific era in remarkably similar terms. This is Jeremiah 30, verses 8 to 9. On that day, says Yahweh of hosts, I will break his yoke from off your neck, and I will burst your bonds, and foreigners shall no more make a servant of him. But they shall serve Yahweh their God and David their king, who will raise up for them. Now, once again, the Synact exhibits a decidedly exegetical hue. The stark constellation of distinctive terminology, yoke, neck, bond, serve, king, is found only in Jeremiah 27 and this oracle, and nowhere else in the entire biblical corpus. Such verbal parallels serve as a strong marker of a genetic relationship between the two texts. The shared theme of foreign servitude, too, reinforces this impression, as does close literary proximity. The literary cycle of Jeremiah 27 to 29, where the Synact appears, immediately precedes the collection of salvation oracles in chapters 30 to 33. In short, the evidence suggests that the yoke on Jeremiah's neck is overtly aligned and coordinated, semantically as well as structurally, with another yoke from a Jeremianic oracle of salvation. Now, turning to the direction of borrowing, there are good grounds to believe that the Synact draws upon Jeremiah 30, verses 8 to 9, rather than the other way around. There are various factors, and one that I would highlight now is that, as others have recognized, the composition of Jeremiah 30, 8 to 9 is sufficiently explainable as a conflation of Jeremiah 2:20 and Isaiah 10:27. And you can see these texts on your screen. So put differently, we do not need to postulate the Synact among the sources for Jeremiah 30. In this respect, it is noteworthy that Jeremiah 2:20 and Jeremiah 38 to 9 share certain elements, such as collocations break your yoke or burst your bonds, that are not found in the Synact. Such commonalities would be difficult to explain on the hypothesis that Jeremiah 30 originated from the Sign Act as opposed to 220. So on balance, then, we have reason to conclude that the Sign Act was derived from Jeremiah 30 verses 8 to 9 as an exegetical development. Now, remarkably, it is not merely peripheral detail that is sourced from Jeremiah 38 to 9, but nothing less than the Sign Act's central imagery, the yoke. But there is a significant transformative element in the Sign Act's reuse of this oracle. The key textual transformation revolves around the activity ascribed to Yahweh in relation to the yoke. Whereas in Jeremiah 38 to 9, Yahweh victoriously shatters the yoke to usher in the dawn of liberation. In the Sign Act, he decrees its installation as a way of saving a remnant of the nation through domination at the hands of the Babylonians. So the Sign Act's fundamental contribution, I would argue, is to enrich the representation of God in the Jeremianic tradition. Observe that in the oracle of Jeremiah 38 to 9, there is a notable silence on the origins of the yoke. We know that Yahweh shatters it, but where it comes from is unclear. It is, in fact, the Sign Act in an exegetical twist that unveils Yahweh's action as having ordained this foreign servitude. The Sign Act then amounts to an exegetical disclosure of Yahweh's actions. And once again, we find that the Sign Act is structurally important, positioned at the gateway to the collection of salvation oracles in chapters 30 to 33. Now, another quick example. In Jeremiah chapter 13, the prophet is instructed to procure and subsequently destroy a linen loincloth. Go and buy a linen loincloth and put it around your waist, and do not dip it in water. Hide it in a cleft of the rocks, and behold, the loincloth was spoiled. It was good for nothing. Now, the garment represents the rebellious nation. And this Sign Act has baffled commentators. Even by Jeremiah's standards, the procedure here is obscure and peculiar. Now, I would suggest that the text that proves utterly crucial for understanding the Sign Act comes from Jeremiah's call narrative. But you, gird up your loins, stand up, and tell them everything that I command you. Now, in the Jeremianic corpus, the roots gird and loins are found only here and nowhere else. This is suggestive. Now, Jeremiah 1:17 employs the collocation is in an idiomatic expression. Jeremiah is commanded to arise and gird his loins in a metaphorical sense. Now, by contrast, the Sign Act develops a complex scenario involving the corresponding nominal loincloth wrapped around Jeremiah's waist. Now, I'd suggest that what's going on here is that the loin girding procedure from Jeremiah's call narrative is, curiously enough, reified in the Sign Act as the prophet purchases and wears a literal loincloth. Now, the actions from the call narrative are then conspicuously reversed as Jeremiah arises and takes the loincloth off to hide it in the cleft of the rock. Now, I propose that the Sign Act is an imaginative, even shocking, play on the imagery from the call narrative. Now, this also speaks to the direction of dependence. It is too far-fetched to imagine that Jeremiah 1:17 somehow borrowed and assembled this very common idiom from the constituent parts scattered in the Sign Act. Now, the image of the loincloth is conjoined with the verb to ruin or spoil. It is a notable destruction catchword in the Jeremianic tradition, occurring here more than in any other book of the Hebrew Bible and acting as a connecting thread. It is typically deployed to portray the coming judgment. Thus, the ominous foe from the north is introduced as a destroyer of nations, and Yahweh appoints against Judah 4 kinds of destroyers. Now, the sign act at this point appears less dependent on any single text. Instead, it keys into this wider leitmotif centered on this verb with a view to interacting with it exegetically. And the chief exegetical operation is to forge a strategic link between this literary strand of reflection on judgment, signposted via the language of destruction, and the call narrative. And the contributions are twofold. In the call narrative, the imagery of loin girding carries the connotations of a legal arraignment on behalf of Yahweh. Gird up your loins, stand up, and tell them everything that I command you. So Jeremiah is to level accusations against Israel. Now, through its linkage of loin girding to the motif of destruction, the sign act, in the first instance, heralds a watershed moment in Jeremiah. The purchase of a new loincloth signals a new divine mission. The time for accusation has passed, and now only punishment will do. As Jeremiah strips off the garment in a pointed reversal of his call narrative, he symbolically acts out the divine judgment. Interestingly, at a structural level, in the present form of the book of Jeremiah, the sign act follows hot on the heels of assorted oracles of accusations in chapters 2 to 12. So once again, the sign act is strategically embedded, positioned as a conclusion to this section of Jeremiah filled with accusations. And secondly, what also emerges with singular emphasis in the sign act is a sense of divine justice. By relating the call narrative literarily to the destruction text, the sign act emphasizes that punishment follows accusation. In this way, the sign act characterizes the divine judgment depicted in the destruction text as neither arbitrary nor unpredictable. The ruined loincloth symbolizes utter destruction, but one wrought in justice. So, towards a conclusion. As a careful comparison of the sign acts with their sources has demonstrated, the logic that animates this exegetical enterprise is rooted in a profound interest in the Jeremianic representation of Yahweh, of divine action. In each of the sign acts examined, we have detected an effort to disclose and describe the nature and extent of divine activity behind the scenes of the Babylonian exile as portrayed in the earlier Jeremianic traditions. But the sign acts, of course, do not simply reinterpret their sources. They also transpose the linguistic materials they borrow into the medium of sign acts. So this is another dimension of this exegetical project that we need to consider, and here I can only gesture towards some ideas. So the question is, why use specifically the medium of sign acts? Why not create a new oracle or a new prose text, for example? Why conduct this reinterpretation in sign acts specifically? Now, much, of course, has been said about the function of sign acts. They have been variously construed as magic, rhetoric, street theater, drama, effectual performances, and so forth. My simple point in this paper is really just to highlight the exegetical dimension to these sign acts that has to be factored into the mix. And in this connection, I would draw on a recent study of embodiment in prophetic literature by Anathea Portier Young. She argues in the study that first-person narration, and she considers specifically call narratives, but sign acts, I think, would fall into this category as well. She argues that first-person narration has been proven to possess greater potential to activate the reader's or hearer's brain in distinctive ways, creating, I quote, heightened immersion, transportation, affective response, identification, and internal simulation. Such first-person narrations, I quote again, locate in space and time the prophet's embodied encounter with an embodied deity. In so doing, they also supply to audiences' imaginations a framework in which they may themselves imagine, recreate, and participate in that encounter. And it is arguably in this light that the transposition of borrowed materials into the medium of sign acts that it begins to take on sharper focus. Notice that the sign acts reify and dramatize the actions attributed to Yahweh, precisely those elements which are also of such great exegetical concern in the sign acts. So we have a certain congruence between inner biblical exegesis and performance. The sign acts emerge, in effect, as textual enactments of Jeremianic texts, with divine actions reinterpreted and embodied and enlivened in imagined and imaginative prophetic performance. Now, another piece of this puzzle is, of course, the structural significance of sign acts. As I mentioned, they're lodged as structurally determinative centerpieces designed to provide the exegetical prism through which the entire book of Jeremiah is to be understood. They're designed as key literary milestones in the Jeremianic tradition. In other words, I would suggest that the sign act's contribution to the argument of Jeremiah is the construction of a strategic exegetical layer that in dramatic and memorable fashion rends the veil between the transcendent and immanent realms. So, in summary, exegesis, structure, and rhetoric and performance work in tandem. In these prophetic performances, the audience gains a direct and abstracted angle of vision on divine action. Much has been made of the suasive power of Jeremiah's vivid prophetic performances, but we can now appreciate that their rhetorical force is recruited specifically in service of their inner biblical interpretation. Jeremiah's sign acts are a powerful exegetical resource and integral part of the creative exegetical repertoire of the Hebrew Bible. Thank you.